Dr. Anisha, how are you doing?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I am good. The sun is still shining here. What time is it by you?
Oh, it's 9:45 in the morning here, so the
Oh,
day is just starting.
yes. So we've got a few clouds, but yeah, the day is doing well. Let me introduce you. So, Dr. Anisha is a pediatrician who specializes in teen health, and you currently are at the National Hospital in DC. You've got a book called Raising Teens, Global Teens, a Practical Handbook to Parenting in the 21st Century. Yes. There we go. Yay. And you've got 25 years. You have done a number of roles, including being Chief of Adolescent Medicine at Georgetown Uni and the lieutenant colonel. You were a colonel in the US Army.
I was a lieutenant colonel in the US Army, yes.
Wow. Wow. And on the facility of the School of Public Health in Chinese University of Hong Kong.
Yes, I've lived in a few places, including Hong Kong and the Netherlands. But currently, as you mentioned, I'm back at Washington, DC at Children's National Hospital and just become acting chief of our division. But I'm very excited to be here and to be speaking to you.
Oh, it's great to have you. So how did you go from being in the army to being, doing lots of stuff about mental health and stuff?
Well, I've always been a physician, even in the military. And I think my interest has always been in working with young people. So that role hasn't changed. And I would certainly say that as a military physician, I was also exposed to young people that were moving around and had the experience of many transitions and changes. And I think those are really important things to be aware of as we also talk about mental health and screening for mental health.
So we are going to be talking about the effects of social media,
yes.
which are just increasing. It feels like month by month. And I love technology, especially over lockdown. Technology was a godsend. But are there guidelines for media use with kids?
Well, that's, I think, a big topic. And I know a lot of the times one that parents ask me, both in my work at the hospital, certainly when I work in communities and I'm working in schools. And I think that the short answer is we as pediatricians used to have very specific guidelines. For example, American Academy of Pediatrics would say no more than 2 hours per day of TV viewing. And we just know, particularly with the pandemic, that's just really difficult. I have 2 boys of my own, and I can say that, many hours of the day are spent on devices, partly because they're doing their work on it, but then it also becomes a way of connecting with friends, and certainly is a way of entertainment. So there's a lot of reasons why young people around the world are on media, and it's also increasingly difficult for parents just to have those very strict guidelines in terms of how many hours per day. So I would say that more and more we're encouraging parents to be what we call media coaches. And you help them to make good decisions. And I would say another rule of thumb that I use in general is what I call the 3 C's. So knowing the context, certainly knowing your child, and also knowing the community that they engage in. And I think this is a helpful way to kind of think about media use in general, much less social media. So what is your child using media for? I mentioned that I have 2 boys. So if they're on Khan Academy or some kind of educational site, I think I have a lot of patience in terms of how much time they use media. But on the other hand, if it's a very violent video game or they're just spending a lot of time on social media, I think that I'm a little bit more aware in terms of maybe we need to make that change, or that they need to be on it just a little bit less. So know the context. But certainly there's some very good sources of media that can be very educational that are very helpful for our kids right now. As I mentioned, the second piece is knowing your child. Some kids have a harder time turning off. And again, we'll talk about that in the context of social media. And so they constantly need to be on it. They're constantly checking it to the point where sometimes they're waking up in the middle of the night or they're lying about use and it's hard for them to stop. Other kids, if you give them some sense of guidelines like, I need for you to go to sleep tonight. I need for you to stop this. We are allowed to do 1 hour of this and then you need to stop, are able to work with those guidelines and that structure. And your child, and if your child's having a harder time with that, again, that's a child that needs a lot more structure. At the end of the day, you as the parent are the one that still owns that device, or probably paying for the device and are in charge of how we can use it. So whether it's taking it out of the room, unplugging it, maybe stopping it for a period of time, you certainly have that. And then the final piece when we talk about 3 C's is, again, knowing how your child is engaging in the larger community. And so is your child, for example, still able to go to school, be able to do the work that they need to, is still engaging with friends, is doing other kind of extracurricular social activities and doing media use, then they probably are okay. On the other hand, if your child is pulling back, is withdrawing, is not doing those things, as I mentioned, is lying about use, is constantly on it, that's the only way that they're getting stimulation, that's a child that you need to worry about more.
So can I just check? Context, child, and what was the third one?
And how they're engaging in the community. So community.
A community. Cool,
Yes.
thanks. What are the top problems? What is the use of social media creating amongst young people?
So I would say that there's some very positive things that come out of social media, and as a pediatrician, and certainly I would encourage anyone that's listening as a parent to realize that you have to have a nuanced view. And a lot of young people tell me, particularly now during the pandemic, that they really think that social media has been important for them as a way of connecting and reaching out to their friends and reaching out to perhaps, family members or people in other places. So I think there are some very positive things that we need to be aware of in terms of social media and not to exclude it completely. I think the flip side is that for some kids, they may be using it quite often. And if you have a child that's on it regularly, and there's some sites probably more than others, where they are constantly looking for likes or attention, and they constantly need to be checking their devices to get that information, that's a child that you need to worry about just a little bit more. And what we do know from the literature is that kids that are on social media frequently, constantly looking for likes, are at 2 times increased risk for things like body image disorders and disordered eating. And so being aware of that is really important. So if you have a daughter, for example, or even a son that's on TikTok and watching a lot of videos, but videos where there's a lot of emphasis in terms of appearance or looks, or similarly posting on Instagram, or looking at certain images on Instagram, that may be someone that you need to check in and say, how are you feeling about yourself? Like when you look at yourself in the mirror, are you feeling okay? Do you feel like you have a pressure to look at a certain way? And is there maybe a reason for us to cut back a little bit on Instagram or TikTok or some of these other apps or devices?
So how many girls, let's still go for girls, do you think don't use filters? Because I'm like, they go to me, you don't use filters? And I'm going, no, I don't. Again, why not? It'll make you look better. And I'm like, yeah, but I don't look like me. So, but I think it's just become the norm, hasn't it?
I would say that there's plenty of adults out there that are probably listening that use filters as well. I certainly know colleagues and friends that do, and who doesn't want to look a little bit better with a use of a filter that takes away their wrinkles or makes them just look better. I think that's really both the challenge and sometimes the things that we need to be aware of when it comes to social media, that it can change. We can use things to enhance our appearance. Not everything is as it appears. And I would probably say that a lot of young people are engaging in it as well. And I think this is a reason for us to kind of come back to the point of what you see out there is not always reality. That's the same for a lot of perhaps advertisements and other things related to body image. And so coming back to what are the things that are important about you, what are your strengths, what are you good at, what are the things on the inside, and how can we build that as opposed to what's on the outside, are other important things that we as parents and caregivers should do. So again, I would say that young people are using filters, but the bigger question is, what is it that's important to you, and how can we make that switch so it's not just about our external appearance?
Yeah. So how can we help them to balance what they see as an image and what they see in reality?
Well, it's $1 million question, isn't it? And like I said, there's many adults that are doing the same thing. So I would say probably 3 different points. As I mentioned first, so much of my work is really focusing on strengths and what is it that young people do well in. And again, every young person probably has something that they excel in or that is unique about them. And also to remind you that our children are uneven. They're going to be good at some things, but not good at others. But we probably know our kids well enough to know what they excel in. So building on those strengths, whether it's art or music or something along those lines, and then really ensuring that we build self-confidence. Self-confidence is developed sometime in the preteen and early adolescent years. So building on self-confidence and building on strengths, I think, is one way to address it. Certainly the other way is, of course, modeling that behavior. And so as adults, we come back to, feeling secure, feeling good about ourselves. Certainly perhaps not, engaging in some of these things that our kids are then going to also look at or watch. And then, of course, having conversations and checking in with our kids just to see how they are doing, or certainly what their friends are doing, is one way to get a better sense of what they're doing and how they're feeling about themselves.
So there's a word here that I've never heard of.
But sharenting is the concept of sharing images of your children or your teenagers on social media. And again, we're talking about children and teenagers using social media. And certainly we know that a number of them will probably post images of themselves. But sharenting is the idea of sharing images, parents sharing images of their kids, but without their consent. And so as we're trying to teach young people about responsibility when it comes to social media, and certainly using it as a positive tool, but also being aware that sometimes when you post things, it just goes out into the universe, and we have to be really thoughtful about what's out there. I also want to remind parents that we need to model some of that responsible behavior and to not post things without consent. And I think our kids have lots of opinions. If we were to ask them, is this picture okay? Do you mind if I put it out to my WhatsApp group or my Facebook group? And getting their consent is an important way for them to realize that they need to also get consent, and they need to be aware of images when they're posting themselves. So be aware of sharenting.
Yeah, and that's really interesting, because most parents think, oh, well, I'm giving consent, rather than their child is giving consent for their self as an individual.
Right. And I think this concept of encouraging and empowering young people to start to make some of those decisions on their own is really important as they're going, particularly through adolescence, but also just realizing that consent when they're posting is an important piece. So by doing that, we're really building on that process.
And you're right, it's about role modeling, because a lot of young people, so we have for years now, we've had the police come out and say, look, when you put an image, it's gone, you can't do anything about it, and they come and say it's criminal offence. So, but they know it, but they still do it, and they know it, and they still do it, and they go around in a circle, round and round. But actually, if as a parent you say to them, it's almost like you are reminding them, but in a really nice way, that to take responsibility over the images and what they're doing, and that it is, like you said, it's there forever. Like,
right. And you bring up a very good point, which is that it's our responsibility as parents to start to have these conversations, not to be reactive when things go out. And so I say that starting these conversations early on, a lot of times our kids have access to devices or phones, probably at much earlier ages than in previous years. And so if they do have access to a device, or you are giving them a smartphone, that's probably the time that you need to be having these conversations as well, in terms of responsibility that comes with it, and certainly what they're posting and what they're viewing. And I would add, this is a really important time to talk about what I call sexting. And sexting is this idea of the fact that, again, people are sharing images, and it can be a whole range of images. It can start with things like emojis, but it can go all the way to very sexually explicit videos. And most young people that I work with in classrooms, certainly by the time that they're maybe 11 or 12 or 13, know someone that's received a sext, much less known someone that's asked for a sext. And when we've done studies among adults, we also know that a lot of adults are also aware of this and are commonly using it. So it's not just among young people. But what I will point out is that many young people, when I work with them in schools or in the hospital situation, they will tell me that they don't think it's a big issue to send a sext or ask a text. So it's common, but on top of that, many young people think it's okay. They have choice, and this is not a big deal, particularly if they trust the person that they're sending the images to. And so this is a really important thing that we as caregivers and providers need to do in terms of being proactive and having those conversations as they're getting devices to say, A, you may be getting this. Are your friends getting this? Are you getting this? B, we need to really be thinking about this, because as we discussed, once you get a request or you send something, you have no control. That goes out into the universe. And then getting them to start thinking about what I call responsibilities. I used to just tell people, don't sext. And it's a bit like telling kids, don't, try to be sexually active or don't try to do something. The more likely they are to be curious and actually go out and try something. So now my new kind of way of approaching this is they're curious, they're probably going to try it, they probably are thinking about it. So we need to talk about what are the consequences or responsibilities that come along with it. And so getting them to start thinking about the fact that when you send this, a parent could see it, a teacher could see it, a classmate could see it. I've certainly worked in schools where sometimes kids use this as blackmail, or they sometimes exchange it for money. I mean, there are all kinds of things that happen with these images that, again, can be really challenging for the person that sent the image in the first place. Even though you trust that person right now that you're sending that image to, what's going to happen in a couple of weeks or a year or 2 years? Are you going to still have that same relationship? And can you really say in all assurance that you know what they're doing with those images in that time? And if you can't answer yes to all of this, then maybe it's a really good time to hold, to push pause, maybe talk to an adult, push delete, but not get involved. And also to think that there's sometimes legal ramifications if you're having these images. As you mentioned, the police don't always know, who's asking, the age of it. In many places, it's considered child pornography, and there can be other rules that go along with it. So being really thoughtful and careful is important. And certainly most schools don't look upon it very favorably. And so they could certainly be at high risk for getting suspended or having other things happen. So talking to kids about the fact that it exists, they're probably going to have pressure, and to understand responsibilities and maybe even role playing what they can do when they are either asked, or they see an image, or perhaps are thinking about asking someone, maybe another way for them to start thinking about good decision making.
So I have a different role. So as a mum, what's your advice then as a mum if a kid shows you something? Because when they're innocent, they're going to show, right. But in my role as outside, I have to take that very seriously. I have to report it, and there's certain actions that need to happen. But as a mum, what's the advice? Say obviously you've got the extremes, like you've got like a really graphic sexual organ, or you've just got a little bit of something that's not
an emoji. Right. I think the answer is, let's be proactive, right? So let's have these conversations before we even get to the place where now we're sharing, or we have images. So I think that's the first takeaway from our discussion today. But secondly, as you pointed out, things could have already occurred, and they may have already had an image, or they disclose it, or you happen to find it as you're looking at devices, or looking at something. And I think then that's where we as parents need to be supportive of our kids, to realize that a very important and normal developmental part of adolescence is actually trying things out and experimenting. And the prefrontal cortex, which is the part of the brain right here, which has to do with logical thought and thinking about consequences, isn't fully developed until you're in your mid-20s. And so a lot of what our kids are doing is trying and testing and not thinking about what's going to happen. And so that's, again, where we need to come back and to realize that we need to be helping them with that decision making. But when they make mistakes, to be there to support them, to help them to understand, okay, we know this happened. Now, where do we go from here? And how do we make sure this doesn't happen again? But how can we support you now that this has occurred? If that makes sense. Otherwise, we lose that opportunity to help them in the future when other things occur. So we really just need to be there to support them. And of course, encourage them to say, don't get any further involved. How do we delete this? How do we work on why this happened in the first place?
Yeah, because you want to maintain an open relationship, a flow of communication.
Yes.
So then how do you handle porn? You say it's very natural. How do you handle porn viewing when it's no longer the magazines underneath the bed kind of thing? Is natural, it's normal to be curious, part of a healthy relationship, like it's about the confidence of the mum, as I don't know, whoever else is there, isn't it? But
so I think your question is, what do we do when it comes to young people and porn viewing? And I will just remind all our listeners that porn viewing is a very normal thing that I've noticed among young people, in that many kids at the age of 12 or 13 will tell me that they have viewed porn at some point. Perhaps it's inadvertently because they're playing a video game and it comes through, or they're curious and they actually look at something. But many young people are actually exposed to porn on a regular basis. So if they have a device, they have a phone, they have a computer, this is, again, a reason why we need to be having these conversations early on as we're giving them those devices, to say, you're probably going to be exposed to this as well. Now, the next piece after that, Many young people tell me they're not quite sure why it's so bad to view it. And I think that's where we have to have a good dialogue about the fact that, yes, you could be curious. Certainly, these images are out there, but I also want you to know that what you're viewing sometimes isn't necessarily indicative of a healthy sexual relationship or a healthy relationship in particular. Many times it can be violent. It can be very kind of, the roles can be very kind of hierarchical, but not the normal consensual roles that we would like to have in a positive relationship. And so kind of breaking it down to say, I understand that you're curious, but this is not, again, a good model of what's out there in terms of a positive relationship. And it could be that we can talk about this, but there are other ways to understand what's a normal and healthy sexual relationship. Now, I've certainly had young people that probably kind of skew to the side of watching a lot of pornography, and parents find out that they're on it constantly. And that's a child that, again, you probably want to talk to a lot more in terms of why that's going on, why they're getting that stimulation in that way. If there's anything else that might be occurring to them, or, has there been anything else that's happened to them in terms of being touched or having perhaps less than healthy kind of views about sexual health. But again, just realizing that this is really normal. Kids are really curious about it. Many times they don't know why it's a challenge or why they shouldn't be viewing it. And so having a very healthy discussion about what's out there and what you think about it can help them with that process.
Yes. So we have a we do. I've got another lady. I forgot her name. I want to call her Karen. Yeah, Karen's talking about sex. Yeah, how to have a calm heart conversations about something that's quite intimate. Yeah. So let's go to the next question. So talking about connection, feeling,
yes,
having friends. So some young people think that they have basically, okay, this is a question from one of the parents. So my son has thousands of followers, but they don't have any real friends who that parent, the mum, knows about, other than going to school, like that. Yeah. So, but yeah, how come they still feel alone? So they've got thousands of friends, but they still feel alone.
Right. And that's such a interesting question and a dilemma that I think we are grappling with right now with the increase in media use among young people, much less adults. And again, I would probably say that even in the literature that we know among adults, that those that are on a lot of these media devices and have lots of followers and constantly engaging can also say that they are feeling more anxious or depressed. So I think it's really important to know that that certainly is the case for young people as well. When they're constantly on devices, constantly trying to have followers, there can still be this issue related to anxiety, depression, and loneliness. And so this, I think, really goes back to the issue of balance, how we as parents need to be good coaches, how we certainly need to make sure that they are engaging in media use as a way to perhaps be connected, but also to realize it's important just to have real connections with people, outside of what we're doing virtually. And of course, the pandemic has made that a little bit more challenging. For long periods of time, kids weren't having those normal interactions. Now that we're kind of coming back into schools, it's really important to build on that and to make sure that they're having healthy in-person conversations and discussions. I sometimes say whatever their unique strengths are, how we can build on that. If you have a child, for example, that likes the arts, like how do we get them back into it? I have a son that likes debate. So, as he was even doing virtual, but much less coming back into full school, really encouraging him to be part of a debate team helped him with confidence and helped him to engage with other young people face to face, that he had something that he shared with. So ways to, again, make sure that they're having real in-person relationships to kind of counteract what they may be experiencing virtually. Also to really come back to, are you feeling down? Are you feeling sad? Are you feeling like life is not worth living? Are important questions to ask kids right now. I can't begin to tell you how many young people we're seeing right now in our clinical and hospital settings that have had anxiety or depression. The numbers have quadrupled, at least in the United States, certainly in the UK and other places. So we're having more kids that are expressing these real concerns. And so as parents, checking in, asking specifically, and making sure we're getting them support if they are saying these things are really important, whether that's, again, another adult, a coach, a mentor, or something along those lines. That's really important too.
Because there's a few parents who said that they know that their children are anxious, and they're not happy, and they're using it, almost self-medicating it by escapism. And so they're stuck because they want to help, but they know that it does help to escape into a virtual world where they are in control and they have power, and they have friends they talk to on it, don't they? It's like a, but how to bring them
back. Well, what we do also know from the literature is that using media can actually give stimulation to dopamine, which is a neurochemical, which can sometimes create a feel-good sensation. And so thinking about ways to switch that are really important. And so one thought that I have is, and certainly we know this from the literature, that having green time is really important, which means getting out and being exposed to nature, being exposed to trees and water, and just being outside. And so how do we make green time equivalent to screen time, I think is a really good concept as we talk about kids that are struggling or not feeling good or using media use a lot to kind of help self-medicate. So that's just one concept. Of course, the other is, again, those are kids that you really need to have those more specific conversations about how they're feeling and how they're struggling. But again, how do we replace what they're getting right now in terms of stimulation with something that's more in person, something that it relates to, again, what their strengths are other ways that I would address it. But again, as much as we can limit that media use, because again, it causes a lot of stimulation, and to make sure that we have some breaks, that they're doing things where you're doing a family walk, an outdoor activity, something where we can do it in a structured way, can be really effective in terms of helping kids like this.
Yeah, I like it. Green time and screen time.
Yes,
you need
sure
a balance of them both.
Yes,
yeah. So I've got a few minutes to ask you this last question that came from loads of people, mums, dads, teachers, lots of different places, and it's all around how predominantly this is girls, but I'm sure there are boys there as well, who get stuck into a conversation on social media where they know the other person isn't saying the truth. They know it's like a tit for tat, and they can't break it, even though they know they should break it, and they know the person is just not healthy, but they're like really hooked in and they can't unhook. So
how do we how do we help navigate relationships or friendships with our children or adolescents, particularly when it's virtual and it's not really in front of you? I think is the question, and particularly when it might be something that can be negative or damaging in terms of their self-esteem.
And especially with somebody who they don't really care about. It's like, because I have this as well. You don't care about them. You don't see them. They don't really know you. What does it matter what they say? And they still can't stop.
Right. And I don't think I have a perfect answer for that question, other than this is where we really need to go back to the basics in terms of how do we build on our kids' self-esteem and self-confidence, and knowing excuse me, about what it is that's really motivating them from the inside, and worrying less about, what other people think, or certainly, about appearance. That's not easy to do in adolescence, because so much of what happens when you're a teenager is really related to your peer group. And unfortunately, what parents think is probably a little bit less important than what young people around them are thinking and what their opinion is. And so being aware of that, understanding that's a developmental process, is one thing for parents to know about. Again, going back to brain development and knowing that for young people, a lot of what they're doing also is not thinking about consequences, is not thinking sometimes in the most logical ways. They are responding to emotion. Their limbic system, which has to do with pleasure and reward and emotion, is much stronger. So they are feeling very strong emotions when these things are happening, but not able to think about it in a broader context. And that's where we as adults can sometimes step in and say, okay, let's look at the big picture here. Like, why are we engaging with this person if they're not making you feel good? And they're really not that important, and you have a much bigger kind of goal in life, and there's so many other things that are unique and special about you. And how can we make you pull away from this, because this is not impacting you in a positive way? I sometimes talk about, what's your dream or your plan in the future? Like, what is it you want to do or be, and how is this kind of connecting to that? Because if it's not helping you, then maybe this is a relationship we need to move away from. That is a powerful thing for a parent to help a child to do. Now, again, I would not sometimes step in completely and just stop that relationship. What I would do is to start to work on how can we help to problem solve and get kids the tools to start to make good decisions when it comes to navigating difficult friendships or relationships. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. No, it does. It does. And unfortunately, I do see some younger parents with the same issue as for the kids. So
this goes back to modeling, and I can certainly agree
yeah.
with you that again, as parents, what we do in terms of our relationships and how we're handling things certainly trickles down to our kids. So making sure that we're giving them really good kind of models in terms of positive relationships and kind of positive ways to interact, I think are also really important. But I think that again, there's so much that is out there that we can do to support our kids to be aware. I really appreciate the time that we've been able to have
I appreciate
with this
sharing.
conversation. And I hope that, again, listeners have been able to get a few good tips from our discussion in terms of social media.
I've learned a new word, sharing.
But
yes.
Again, I would love to end by just saying it's never too early to have these discussions. And I say this the same about sexual health, which I know you're going to be talking about later, but it's never too early to start talking about social media and kids, because more and more kids are getting access to devices, and as a result, access to things like sexting and porn, and certainly trying to navigate all of these sites. So again, coming back to this is a really wonderful time to start having these conversations. It isn't just a one-time conversation. It's something that we continue to keep building on as kids grow.
Absolutely, absolutely. And for us to be aware of, because things do change, they need to be, and sometimes they'll teach us.
Absolutely. I always learn.
Yeah. So thank you for your time. I appreciate it so much. Have a good rest of your day, because you're still in the morning bit. And I shall catch up with you another time.
Thank
you. Bye.
Bye-bye.